On the morning of March the 14th, 1701, a feudal lord named Asano Naganori walks through the great corridor of the pines inside Edo Castle. Within minutes, he would draw his sword and attack a senior court official in full view of the shogun's household. The act would cost him his life before the day was out, destroy his family's domain, and set in motion a chain of events that would become the most celebrated story of loyalty and revenge in Japanese history. This is the story of the 47 Rōnin. It is a story rooted in the rigid hierarchies of early 18th century Japan, in a world where ceremony carried the weight of politics, where public humiliation could be a mortal wound, and where the bonds between a lord and his samurai were expected to endure beyond death itself. Over the course of 2 episodes, we will follow the full arc of this extraordinary sequence of events. The events themselves are well documented in contemporary Edo period records, though, as with any story that has been retold for over 3 centuries, the line between history and legend is not always clear. The 47 Rōnin became the subject of one of the most famous works in Japanese theatre, the Chushingora, and have been reimagined in countless films, novels, and popular retellings since. But even stripped of its mythological layers, the core of this story remains remarkable. It is a story about what happens when the demands of personal honor collide with the authority of the state, and about a group of men who made a choice that they knew would end in their own deaths. It begins in Edo, the sprawling capital of Tokugawa Japan, in the early spring of 1701. Part 1. The World of the Tokugawa. By the time of the events in this story, Japan had been at peace for nearly a century. That peace was the product of a single family's grip on power, the Tokugawa, and the elaborate systems of control they had built to maintain it. The Tokugawa shogunate had its origins in the wars of unification that consumed Japan through the 16th century. After generations of conflict between rival feudal lords, a series of 3 great military leaders gradually brought the country's warring domains under a single authority. The last of these was Tokugawa Ieyasu, who defeated his remaining rivals at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 and established himself as shogun, the supreme military ruler of Japan, in 1603. The emperor remained in Kyoto as a ceremonial and spiritual figurehead, but real political and military power now resided with the Tokugawa in their capital at Edo, the city we know today as Tokyo. Ieyasu and his successors built a political order designed above all else to prevent any future challenge to their rule. Japan's roughly 260 feudal domains continued to be governed by their own lords, known as daimyo, but these lords existed within a tightly controlled hierarchy. They were classified according to their historical relationship with the Tokugawa. Those who had been allies before Sekigahara held a different status from those who had submitted only after defeat. Marriage alliances between daimyo families required the shogun's approval. The construction or repair of castles was strictly regulated, and an extensive network of inspectors and informants kept the shogunate aware of what was happening across the country. By 1701, the 5th Tokugawa shogun, Tsunayoshi, had held power for over 2 decades. Edo had grown into one of the largest cities in the world, with a population that may have exceeded 1 million. The castle at its center was an enormous complex of walls, moats, gates, and ceremonial halls, and it served as both the seat of government and the stage on which the political life of the nation was performed. One of the most important mechanisms of Tokugawa control was the Sankin Kotai system, often translated as alternate attendance. Under this system, every daimyo in Japan was required to maintain a residence in Edo and to spend alternating periods, typically 1 year, living in the capital under the shogun's eye before returning to his home domain. When a lord was back in his own territory, his wife and children were required to remain in Edo, effectively serving as hostages to guarantee his continued loyalty. The practical consequences of this system were enormous. Daimyo had to maintain 2 full households, one in their home domain and one in Edo, and the regular journeys between the two were elaborate, expensive processions that could involve hundreds or even thousands of retainers, guards, servants, and porters. The cost of these processions, combined with the expense of maintaining a prestigious Edo residence, acted as a constant financial drain on even the wealthiest domains. This was by design. Lords who were perpetually spending their resources on travel and appearances in the capital had far less capacity to stockpile weapons, build fortifications, or fund a rebellion. The system also meant that Edo was always full of daimyo and their retainers. The political and social life of the capital revolved around the interactions between these lords, their households, and the officials of the shogunate, and at the heart of that social life was ceremony. Ceremony in Tokugawa Japan was serious business. The elaborate rituals and protocols that governed court life were expressions of the political order itself. The way a lord dressed, the gifts he presented, the precise manner in which he bowed, the words he used in formal greetings, all of these carried meaning. Getting them right demonstrated competence, respect, and an understanding of one's place within the hierarchy. Getting them wrong could cause genuine political embarrassment, and in the most sensitive contexts could be interpreted as an insult to the shogunate, or even to the emperor. Among the most important ceremonial occasions were the periodic receptions of envoys from the imperial court in Kyoto. The emperor, though politically sidelined, retained enormous symbolic and spiritual authority, and visits from his representatives to the shogun's court were occasions of the highest significance. Everything about these receptions, the greetings, the seating arrangements, the gifts, the banquets, the entertainment, had to be executed according to precise and often arcane rules of protocol. The responsibility for ensuring that everything went smoothly fell to designated officials, both the daimyo assigned to host the envoys and the court specialists who instructed them in the proper forms. This world of ceremony created its own economy of influence. The officials responsible for advising daimyo on protocol held considerable informal power. A lord who was unfamiliar with the correct procedures, and many were, since these duties rotated and the rules were complex, depended heavily on the guidance of these specialists. It was customary for daimyo to offer generous gifts to the officials who helped them, and those who were perceived as insufficiently generous could expect to receive less attentive or less helpful instruction. This was understood by everyone involved. It was simply how things worked. The men who navigated this world were samurai, members of Japan's warrior class, though by 1701 the word warrior had become somewhat aspirational. The great battles of the unification era were a century in the past. Samurai still carried their two swords, the katana and the shorter wakizashi, as markers of their status, and they still trained in martial arts. But in practice, most samurai of this era were administrators, bureaucrats, and courtiers. They managed domains, collected taxes, oversaw public works, and spent their days in meetings and paperwork rather than on battlefields. Yet the ideals of the warrior class retained a powerful hold on samurai identity. The principles that would later be codified under the term bushido, loyalty to one's lord, personal honor, courage, self-discipline, and a readiness to die rather than suffer disgrace, were deeply embedded in how samurai understood themselves and their place in society. A samurai who was publicly shamed and failed to respond was diminished in the eyes of his peers and his own household. A retainer who did not avenge a wrong done to his lord was failing in his most fundamental duty. This created a tension at the heart of Tokugawa society. The shogunate had built its entire political order around stability, obedience, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. The samurai class, which formed the backbone of that order, defined itself by a code that valorized personal honor and martial courage, values that could, under the right circumstances, lead men to acts of violence that the state could not tolerate. For most of the Edo period, this tension remained theoretical. Samurai served their lords, followed the protocols, and lived out their lives within the system. But every system has its pressure points. And in the spring of 1701, two men found themselves at exactly such a point. One, a provincial lord assigned to a ceremonial duty he was ill prepared for, the other, a powerful court official who expected to be well compensated for his expertise. The collision between them would expose the fault lines that ran beneath the surface of Tokugawa Japan's carefully maintained order. The lord's name was Asano Naganori, the official's name was Kira Yoshinaka, and the place where their conflict would come to a head was the most politically sensitive building in the country, Edo Castle itself. Part 2, Asano and Kira. Asano Naganori was the lord of the Ako domain, a modest but prosperous territory in Harima province in what is today Hyogo prefecture in western Japan. He was the third generation of his family to hold the domain, and by the standards of the Tokugawa hierarchy, the Asano of Aku were respectable but not especially powerful. Their territory was known primarily for its salt production, which provided a steady income, and the domain was generally well administered. Asano was around 35 years old at the time of the events in this story. He had inherited the lordship of Ako as a young man and had governed it without particular controversy. The sources that survive describe him as sincere and conscientious, a lord who took his duties seriously and was well regarded by his retainers. He was not, however, a man with deep experience of the political intrigues and social gamesmanship of the shogun's court in Edo. Ako was a long way from the capital, both geographically and in terms of political significance. Asano had spent time in Edo as required by the Sankin Kotai system, but the rarefied world of high court ceremony was not his natural environment. In the early months of 1701, Asano was appointed to serve as one of two daimyo responsible for receiving and entertaining envoys from the imperial court in Kyoto. This was a significant honor, but also a significant burden. The reception of imperial envoys was one of the most protocol-intensive events on the shogunate's calendar, and the daimyo assigned to oversee it bore personal responsibility for ensuring that every detail was handled correctly. A mistake would reflect badly on the lord himself, on the shogunate, and potentially on the relationship between the shogun and the emperor. Asano's fellow appointee was a lord named Kame Korechika, the daimyo of the Tutuano domain. Both men were expected to learn the elaborate procedures required for the reception, and the official assigned to instruct them was Kira Yoshinaka. Kira held the title of Kozuke no Suke, and his formal role was that of Koke, a master of ceremonies with deep expertise in the protocols of the Tokugawa court. He was considerably older than Asano, experienced, well-connected, and had served in this instructional capacity before. His knowledge of court etiquette was extensive, and for the daimyo who depended on it, essentially indispensable. The historical record on Kira is complicated by the fact that most surviving accounts of these events were written by people sympathetic to Asano and the Ako Rōnin. In the Chushingura dramatizations that followed, Kira became an outright villain, petty, cruel, and corrupt. The real Kira may have been less cartoonishly malicious, but even the more measured historical sources suggest a man who took the customary gift-giving system very seriously, and who did not respond well when he felt he was not being adequately compensated for his services. This was the heart of the problem. When daimyo were assigned ceremonial duties and placed under the guidance of a court official like Kira, it was standard practice to present that official with generous gifts. These were not technically bribes, they were understood as expressions of gratitude and respect. But in practical terms, the quality of instruction a lord received was closely linked to the generosity of his offerings. Lords who gave lavishly could expect attentive, detailed, and helpful guidance. Those who gave modestly could expect something rather less. Asano, by most accounts, did not offer Kira the level of gifts that Kira expected. The reasons for this are debated. Some sources suggest that Asano was simply unfamiliar with the conventions and did not realize how much was expected. Others suggest that he considered the practice distasteful and chose not to participate in it on principle. A few accounts imply that the Ako domain's finances, while stable, did not allow for the kind of extravagant gift-giving that a wealthier lord might have managed. Whatever the reason, the result was that Kira felt slighted. Kame Korechika, the other daimyo assigned to the same duty, reportedly handled the situation differently. According to several accounts, Kame's retainers recognized the danger early and arranged for substantial gifts to be sent to Kira. After that, Kira's treatment of Kame apparently improved markedly. This detail, if accurate, underlines the transactional nature of the relationship and highlights how Asano's failure to play the game left him exposed. What followed was a sustained campaign of what can only be described as humiliation. Kira's treatment of Asano deteriorated sharply. The sources describe him giving Asano deliberately poor or incomplete guidance on the ceremonial procedures, providing instructions late or not at all, and mocking Asano openly in front of other officials and retainers. He is said to have made pointed remarks about Asano's provincial background, implying that a lord from a minor domain could not be expected to understand the refinements of court life. The specific incidents are recorded with varying levels of detail across different accounts, and it is difficult to verify each one independently. But the overall pattern is consistent across the sources. Kira treated Asano with contempt, and he did so publicly. In the context of Tokugawa court culture, where reputation and face were everything, this was deeply damaging. One frequently cited episode describes Kira giving Asano incorrect instructions about the proper attire for a particular ceremony. Asano arrived dressed inappropriately, causing him embarrassment in front of his peers. Whether this specific incident occurred exactly as described is uncertain, but it illustrates the kind of vulnerability Asano faced. He was entirely dependent on Kira for guidance, and Kira was actively undermining him. It is worth pausing here to consider what this would have meant to a man in Asano's position. He was a daimyo, a feudal lord, a member of the samurai class. His identity, his standing among his peers, and his authority over his own retainers all rested on his reputation for honor and competence. The ceremonial duty he had been assigned was a public stage, observed by other lords, by officials of the shogunate, and by representatives of the imperial court. Every failure of protocol, every moment of visible confusion, every cutting remark from Kira chipped away at Asano's standing in a world where standing was everything. Asano had no easy way out. He could not refuse the assignment or simply ignore Kira's behavior without appearing weak. He could not formally complain to the shogunate about a senior official's conduct without evidence that would be difficult to produce and without risking the appearance of making excuses for his own ceremonial failures. He was trapped in a situation where he was being publicly degraded and had no sanctioned means of responding. The days leading up to March the 14th saw the preparations for the envoy reception reaching their final stages. The pressure on Asano was mounting. He had to perform his ceremonial duties correctly in front of the most important audience in the country, and the man responsible for preparing him was actively working against him. Different accounts offer different versions of the final provocation. Some describe a specific insult delivered by Kira on the morning of the 14th, a remark so pointed and so public that Asano could no longer contain himself. Others suggest that there was no single trigger, that the attack was the result of accumulated fury finally boiling over. The truth is that we do not know exactly what was said or done in those final moments before Asano acted. The sources agree on the broad strokes, that Kira's behavior toward Asano was deliberately provocative and that Asano eventually reached a point where he could endure no more. But the precise sequence of events in those last hours is uncertain. What we do know is that by the morning of March the 14th, Asano Naganori had been subjected to weeks of public humiliation by a man he could neither challenge through official channels nor simply ignore. He was a samurai lord in a culture that taught him that honor was worth more than life, and that to suffer insult without response was a form of death in itself. And he was inside Edo Castle, the one place in all of Japan where what he was about to do would carry the most severe consequences imaginable. His counterpart in this conflict, Kira Yoshinaka, appears to have had no sense that he had pushed Asano to a breaking point. Kira was operating within a system he understood well, one in which his position gave him leverage, and in which daimyo who failed to show proper appreciation could expect to be treated accordingly. There is no evidence that Kira anticipated any physical danger. In the orderly world of Tokugawa Japan, disputes between officials and lords were resolved through political channels, through intermediaries, through the quiet application of pressure and influence. Violence within the walls of the castle was simply outside the realm of what men like Kira expected to face. That expectation was about to be shattered. Part 3. The Corridor of the Pines. Edo Castle, on the morning of March the 14th, 1701, was deep in preparation. The reception of the imperial envoys from Kyoto was imminent, one of the most important ceremonial events on the shogunate's calendar, and the castle's inner chambers were busy with officials, attendants, and administrators attending to the final details. Lords and senior figures of the shogunate moved through the corridors and reception halls, reviewing arrangements, conferring with one another, and ensuring that everything was in order for the days ahead. The atmosphere would have been one of focused, purposeful activity, the kind of controlled intensity that accompanied any event where the prestige of the shogun and the dignity of the imperial court were both at stake. Asano Naganori was among those present in the castle that morning. As one of the two daimyo appointed to oversee the reception, he had direct responsibilities for the ceremonies to come, and he would have been expected to be visible, prepared, and composed. He had spent the preceding weeks under the instruction of Kira Yoshinaka, learning, or attempting to learn, the elaborate protocols required of him. How he carried himself that morning, what his state of mind was as he moved through the castle's inner chambers, is not something the historical sources describe in detail. But given what had transpired over the previous weeks, it is reasonable to conclude that Asano was a man under considerable strain. The weeks of preparation had been, by all accounts, a bruising experience. Kira's contemptuous treatment had left Asano publicly embarrassed on multiple occasions, poorly prepared for the duties he was expected to perform, and with no effective means of redress. He was days away from the most high-profile ceremonial role of his career, and the man responsible for helping him succeed in that role had instead done everything possible to ensure he would fail. Whatever Asano was feeling that morning, anger, humiliation, desperation, or some combination of all three, he had carried it with him into the most politically sensitive building in Japan. The specific location where events came to a head was the Matsu no Roka, the Great Corridor of the Pines. This was one of the principal passageways within the castle's inner enclosure, a long and formal corridor that connected several of the important reception and audience rooms. It took its name from the large painted scenes of pine trees that decorated the fusuma, the sliding panel doors lining its walls. These paintings were the work of artists of the Kano school, one of the most prestigious schools of painting in Japan, and they lent the corridor an atmosphere of grandeur and refinement befitting its location at the heart of the shogun's residence. The Corridor of the Pines was a space that people passed through on their way to and from the business of government. On a busy morning of ceremonial preparation, it would have had regular foot traffic from officials of various ranks. It was in this corridor that Asano encountered Kira. What happened between the two men in the moments before the attack is similarly uncertain. Several near-contemporary accounts describe a final exchange of words, with Kira delivering a parting insult or dismissive remark that pushed Asano past his limit. Some versions describe Kira making a contemptuous comment about Asano's competence or his fitness for the role he had been assigned. Others suggest that Kira simply treated Asano with the same casual disdain he had shown throughout the preceding weeks, and that it was the sheer accumulation of slights rather than any single remark that finally broke something in Asano. Something happened between the two men. A remark, a look, a final act of disrespect, and Asano Naganori decided that he could endure no more. What followed happened very quickly. Asano called out to Kira, making clear that what was about to happen was a deliberate act of retribution. The words most commonly attributed to him across the sources translate roughly as a declaration that this was for the grudge he held against Kira. Then he drew his wakizashi, the shorter of the two swords that samurai carried at their side, and attacked. The choice of weapon is worth noting. The wakizashi was a blade of roughly 1 to 2 shaku in length, somewhere between 30 and 60 centimeters, and was the sword a samurai wore at all times, even indoors, as a mark of his status. The longer katana was typically removed or left with attendants when entering the interior of the castle. The wakizashi was therefore the weapon Asano had available to him, and it was a weapon designed more for close-quarters use than for the kind of decisive killing stroke a katana could deliver. Asano's first strike caught Kira on the forehead, opening a cut across his brow. It was a wound that bled heavily, but it was not life-threatening. Kira reeled from the blow, stumbling or falling to the floor of the corridor. Asano moved to press his attack, attempting to deliver a second, more decisive strike. But the commotion had been immediate and impossible to miss. A shout, the sight of a drawn blade, a man bleeding on the floor of one of the castle's most prominent corridors, this would have drawn the attention of everyone nearby within seconds. The man most consistently credited with intervening was Kajikawa Yosabai, a shogunate official who was in the vicinity when the attack began. Kajikawa physically seized Asano and restrained him, preventing him from reaching Kira again. Other officials in the corridor quickly moved to assist, and Asano was pulled away from his target. Some accounts describe a brief struggle, with Asano attempting to break free and continue the attack before being overpowered. Others describe him submitting relatively quickly once it was clear he could not reach Kira. Kira was alive. The wound to his forehead was ugly and bloody, but he had survived. He was attended to by those around him and removed from the corridor. He would carry the scar from Asano's blade for the rest of his life. Asano, now disarmed and held by multiple officials, did not attempt to deny or minimize what he had done. He had attacked a senior official of the shogunate in broad daylight in the inner chambers of Edo Castle in the presence of witnesses. There was nothing to deny. The accounts describe him as agitated but lucid. He had acted with full awareness of what he was doing and where he was doing it. Asano had made a decision, and he appeared to understand what it would cost him. The significance of the act itself is difficult to overstate. Edo Castle was the seat of Tokugawa power, the physical and symbolic center of the political order that had governed Japan for a century. Its inner chambers were spaces of absolute decorum, where the rituals and protocols of government were conducted with meticulous care. The very idea that a lord would draw a weapon and shed blood within those walls was a violation of the most fundamental rules of the system. The castle was the one place in Japan where the shogun's authority was most visibly embodied, and an act of violence there was an act of violence against the order itself. There was historical precedent for this kind of incident, and the precedent was grim. In 1684, less than 20 years earlier, a junior official named Inaba Masayasu had been killed inside Edo Castle by a young samurai named Tsuchiya Goro, who attacked him in one of the castle's corridors. Tsuchiya was cut down almost immediately by those nearby. The incident had been treated as a profound breach of order and had lingered in institutional memory. The shogunate had no tolerance for bloodshed within its walls, and there was no ambiguity about what the consequences would be for anyone who committed such an act. Asano was quickly removed from the corridor and placed under formal custody. He was escorted out of the castle and taken to the Edo residence of Tamura Ukyo no Taibu, a daimyo whose household was designated to hold Asano while the shogunate determined the next steps. This was a form of honorable confinement. Asano was a lord, and he was treated with the formality that his rank demanded even as the machinery of judgment began to turn. The report of the attack reached Shogun Tokugawa Tsunayoshi quickly. The shogun's reaction, according to the accounts that survive, was one of immediate and intense anger. Tsunayoshi had ruled Japan for over 20 years and had invested heavily in promoting a vision of the shogunate as a government of order, learning, and moral authority. He had championed Confucian scholarship, promoted elaborate legal codes, and, most controversially, enacted sweeping laws protecting animals, particularly dogs, that had earned him the derisive nickname Inu Kuba, or the Dog Shogun, among his critics. Whatever one thought of Tsunayoshi's policies, he was a man who took the dignity of his office and the orderliness of his government very seriously. An armed attack inside his own castle, on a day when preparations were underway to receive the emperor's envoys, was an affront that struck at everything he had built. The political reverberations of the incident rippled outward through the castle and beyond. Senior officials of the shogunate would have been conferring immediately. This was a matter that required a swift and decisive response. The imperial envoys were expected imminently, and the reception ceremonies had to proceed regardless of what had just happened. The practical question of who would take over Asano's ceremonial duties had to be addressed. And the larger question, what to do with Asano himself, demanded an answer that would reaffirm the shogunate's authority in the clearest possible terms. The answer would come before the day was over. Part 4. A Lord's Death and the Making of Rōnin. The shogun's decision came with extraordinary speed. On the same day as the attack, March the 14th, 1701, Tokugawa Tsunayoshi ordered that Asano Naganori was to commit seppuku. There would be no formal investigation into the weeks of provocation that had preceded the incident or examination of Kira Yoshinaka's conduct. The sentence was issued, and it was to be carried out before the day was over. The swiftness of the judgment reflected the shogun's fury, but it also reflected a deliberate choice about how the incident would be framed. By ordering immediate seppuku without a hearing, Tsunayoshi was treating the matter as a straightforward case of a lord committing an unforgivable breach of conduct within the castle. The question of why Asano had acted, what had driven him to draw his blade, was being set aside entirely. In the shogun's judgment, the act itself was all that mattered. A weapon had been drawn in Edo Castle. Blood had been spilled in the corridors of power. The response had to be swift, decisive, and unambiguous. What made this judgment so controversial, both at the time and in the years that followed, was its one-sidedness. Tokugawa law and custom included a well-established principle known as kenka ryosaibai, which held that in a quarrel or dispute between two parties, both sides bore responsibility and both should face consequences. The logic of this principle was straightforward. A quarrel, by definition, involved the actions of more than one person, and a just resolution required examining the conduct of everyone involved. It was a principle that had been applied in countless disputes between samurai, and it was widely understood as a foundational element of how the shogunate administered justice. Under kenka ryosaibai, Kira should have faced at least some form of scrutiny, even if Asano's act was indefensible in its execution, and few would have argued otherwise. The question of what had provoked it was relevant. Had there been an investigation, the weeks of deliberate humiliation, the withholding of proper instruction, and the pattern of public contempt that Kira had directed at Asano would all have come to light. Kira might not have faced the same severity of punishment, but he would have been held to account in some measure. Instead, Kira received nothing. No censure, no investigation, no consequences of any kind. He was treated purely as a victim, a senior official who had been attacked without justification by an unstable lord. The narrative that the shogun's judgment imposed on the events was clean and simple, and it bore little resemblance to what those familiar with the situation understood to have actually occurred. This was not lost on the officials and lords of Edo. The sources record murmuring and discontent among those who knew the background of the dispute. The shogun's judgment may have been legally defensible in a narrow sense. The act of drawing a weapon in the castle was indeed a capital offense regardless of provocation, but it offended a deeper sense of fairness. Many felt that Tsunayoshi had prioritized the appearance of swift authority over the substance of justice. None of this, however, changed the outcome. The sentence stood, and it was to be carried out that evening at the residence of Tamura Ukyo no Taibu, where Asano had been held since his removal from the castle. Seppuku was a ritual with deep roots in samurai culture, and it carried a meaning that went beyond mere punishment. It was the manner of death reserved for samurai, a death that, even in its agony, preserved the honor of the man who performed it. A samurai who committed seppuku was not being executed like a criminal. He was being granted the opportunity to end his own life with dignity, to demonstrate his courage and self-mastery in his final act. The distinction mattered enormously in a culture where how a man died could define how he was remembered. The ritual itself was conducted according to precise and formal procedures. The condemned man would be dressed in white, the color of death in Japanese tradition. He would be brought to a prepared space, typically a room or courtyard that had been arranged for the occasion, and seated on a mat. Before him would be placed a stand holding a short blade, either a tantu or a wakizashi, along with materials for writing a death poem, the jisai, which was a customary final composition. Official witnesses would be present to observe and verify that the ritual was carried out correctly, and standing to the side or behind the condemned man would be the kaishakunin, the designated assistant whose role was to deliver a sword stroke to the neck at the moment of greatest agony, ending the suffering swiftly. Asano Naganori performed the ritual on the evening of March the 14th. The accounts that survive record that he conducted himself with composure. Some sources preserve what they claim to be his death poem, composed in the moments before he took up the blade. The poem, in the tradition of jisei, is brief and reflective, an image of cherry blossoms and the transience of life. Whether the specific words attributed to him are exactly what he wrote, or whether they were refined or embellished in later retellings, is impossible to verify with certainty. What the sources consistently convey is that Asano met his death in a manner that his contemporaries regarded as befitting a samurai. His body was taken from the Tamura residence to Sengaku-ji, a Buddhist temple in the Takanawa district of Edo. He was buried there in the temple grounds. Sengaku-ji was not a particularly grand or famous temple at the time. Within 2 years, it would become one of the most visited sites in Japan. The consequences of Asano's death extended far beyond his own life. In the days that followed, the shogunate issued its orders regarding the Ako domain. The judgment was total. Asano's lands were to be confiscated, his castle surrendered, and his domain dissolved. The Asano family's status as daimyo was extinguished. Asano's younger brother, Asano Daigaku Nagahiro, was not permitted to inherit the domain or to continue the family's position within the Tokugawa hierarchy. He was instead placed under the custodial supervision of another lord, a decision that effectively closed the door on any possibility of the family's restoration through normal channels. For the people of the Ako domain, the impact was devastating. The domain had functioned as a community, a network of economic, social, and military relationships all centered on the lord and his household. The samurai who served the Asano family depended on the domain for their stipends, their housing, their social standing, and their sense of purpose. When the domain ceased to exist, all of that vanished with it. Over 300 samurai, along with their wives, children, and dependents, were cast out of the only life they had known. These men were now Rōnin. The word itself tells the story of their condition. It is sometimes translated as wave man or drifting man, evoking the image of a person carried along by forces beyond his control, without anchor or destination. In the social order of Tokugawa Japan, where every person had a defined place and a defined role, to be Rōnin was to exist outside the structure entirely. A samurai without a lord was a samurai without an identity. He retained his swords and his training, but he had lost the context that gave those things meaning. The practical realities of life as Rōnin were harsh. A samurai's stipend, paid in rice or its monetary equivalent, ceased the moment his lord's domain was dissolved. He had no income, no official position, and no patron. Finding new employment with another lord was possible but difficult, particularly for men whose former master had been publicly disgraced. Many lords would have been reluctant to take on retainers from a dissolved domain, wary of associating themselves with the taint of Asano's offense. Some Rōnin managed to find positions through personal connections or by demonstrating exceptional skills. Others were forced into occupations that would have been considered beneath a samurai: manual labor, petty trade, or teaching in private schools. Some simply fell into poverty. The social stigma compounded the material hardship. Samurai were the ruling class of Tokugawa Japan, and their status was a source of profound personal pride. To lose that status, to become a man without a master in a society that defined worth through service and loyalty, was a form of social death. Rōnin were viewed with a mixture of pity and suspicion by those around them. Pitied for their misfortune, but suspected of being unreliable, disloyal, or simply unlucky. The former retainers of Ako bore the additional burden of being associated with a lord who had committed one of the most shocking acts in recent memory. This was the world that over 300 men and their families entered in the spring of 1701, and it was in this context that the actions of one man in particular would begin to shape what came next. Oishi Yoshio was the Karo of the Ako domain, the chief retainer, the most senior samurai in the lord's service. He was in his mid-40s, a man who had spent his career in the administration of the domain and who was widely respected by the other retainers for his competence, his steadiness, and his loyalty to the Asano family. When word reached Ako of their lord's death and the shogunate's orders regarding the domain, it was Oishi to whom every retainer looked for guidance. The news would have arrived within days of the events in Edo, carried by messenger along the roads that connected the capital to the provinces. The sequence of what Oishi learned was staggering in its totality. His lord had attacked a court official, had been ordered to commit seppuku the same day, had died that evening, and the domain was to be confiscated and dissolved. Everything that Oishi had spent his career building and maintaining was gone. The man he had served was dead, and the man who had provoked the entire catastrophe, Kira Yoshinaka, was alive and untouched. Oishi faced an immediate crisis that demanded practical leadership before anything else. The shogunate had ordered the surrender of Edo Castle, and the question of how to respond divided the retainers sharply. A faction among the samurai argued for resistance. They wanted to barricade themselves inside the castle and fight to the death, making a final stand that would at least demonstrate their honor and their refusal to accept what had been done to their lord. This was not an irrational position within the framework of samurai values. A glorious death in defiance of injustice had a long and respected tradition in warrior culture. Others argued for acceptance. The shogunate's authority was absolute, and armed resistance would accomplish nothing beyond getting everyone killed and bringing further disgrace on the Asano name. These men urged Oishi to comply with the order, surrender the castle peacefully, and focus on petitioning the shogunate for the restoration of the domain under Asano Daigaku. Oishi navigated between these positions with considerable skill. He organized the peaceful surrender of Edo Castle, ensuring that the handover was conducted with order and dignity rather than chaos or defiance. The castle was turned over to shogunate officials, the domain's records and assets were accounted for, and the retainers and their families began the process of dispersing from the castle town that had been their home. It was a managed dissolution rather than a collapse, and it preserved the reputation of the Ako retainers as disciplined and honorable men even in defeat. But Oishi was doing more than simply managing a surrender. In the weeks that followed, as the retainers scattered from Ako, a smaller group remained in close communication with him. These were men who shared Oishi's conviction that the peaceful handover of the castle was a necessary step, but not the final one. The petition for the restoration of the domain would go forward. It was the proper and legal course of action, and it had to be pursued. But if it failed, and if Kira continued to live without consequence while their lord lay in his grave at Sengaku-ji, then something more would be required. The conversations were quiet and careful. Nothing was committed to paper that did not need to be. The group that coalesced around Oishi did so gradually, through trust built over years of shared service rather than through any dramatic oath or public declaration. Many retainers who initially expressed willingness to act eventually fell away. Some found new positions and moved on, others lost their nerve, and others simply concluded that the risks were too great and the chances of success too slim. By the time the group had fully taken shape, 47 men remained. They were samurai of varying rank and age, from senior retainers who had held positions of responsibility in the domain to younger men who had barely begun their careers in Asano's service. What they shared was a commitment to their dead lord and a refusal to accept that his death would go unanswered while Kira lived on in comfort in Edo. In the months that followed the fall of Ako, these 47 men dispersed across Japan. They left their families. They took up new identities, new occupations, new lives in cities and towns far from one another. To anyone watching, they appeared to be exactly what they were supposed to be, former retainers of a disgraced lord, scattered and broken, drifting through the world as Rōnin with no purpose and no prospects. Kira Yoshinaka, in his mansion in Edo, had every reason to believe that the affair was over. His wound had healed. His position was secure. The man who had attacked him was dead, and the men who had served that man were gone. We will find out in the next episode that he was wrong. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.